Greetings and welcome to Writers on Writing. I'm your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and I'm coming to you from Medgar Evers College. I'm the founder and director of the Center for Black Literature and director of the National Black Writers Conference, and also a professor here at Medgar Evers College. Writers on Writing is paid for by Medgar Evers College as a radio podcast or broadcast. And we come to you every Sunday and give you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. I'm very, very pleased to have in conversation with me today a writer who has been writing for quite some time, like nearly 50 years, I would say, and we met many years ago, and it is Wesley Brown. Welcome, Wesley.
Well, thank you, Brenda, for inviting me onto your show.
Okay, so let me just share a little bit about Wesley Brown. He's an Atlanta-based writer and educator whose work spans fiction, poetry, biography, theater, and film. And his work is really distinguished by the musicality of his speech and his balance of humorous, ironic, and political engagement with American history. His most recent book is Blue and Green, and then his novel, Tragic Magic, was reissued recently. His short stories and essays have been published widely. Wesley Brown has been called a writer's writer, and the dialogue in Blue and Green is remarkable. And we meet many artists, musicians in the book. His book has been called A Gorgeous Jazz Composition. So again, Wesley Brown. And if you will begin by giving us a brief synopsis of Blue and Green, and then we'd like to hear you read shortly from it.
Okay. Blue and Green is set in August of 1959. On that night when Miles Davis and his sextet were playing at Birdland. And Miles Davis had come out of the club to smoke a cigarette and escort a woman to a cab. And he, at that point, was accosted by a police officer who assumed that he was loitering and also that he had escorted a white woman into the cab. So he had some issues about that. And so that altercation leads to Miles Davis being beaten by the police, arrested, charged with disorderly conduct. And so the novella follows Miles Davis on that night, the things that transpire, and also it focuses on Frances Taylor, who he married and who was an extraordinary artist, a dancer who performed with Katherine Dunham, was in the original production of West Side Story. So she is also part of the narrative. And so on this night that he's beaten by police outside of Birdland, it also follows her feeling or her emotions about where she is and where they are in their relationship.
So we meet many people in Blue and Green. We meet many writers and artists. How did you go about doing the research and really want you to talk about that, and also captivating the language, because you really place the reader as if they are in that room with you, or the protagonist?
Well, I did an enormous amount of reading, everything I could find on, of course, Miles Davis, also Dizzy Gillespie, Bill Evans, Coltrane, as well as Eartha Kitt, Katherine Dunham, and Lena Horne. So after doing all that reading, then of course comes the real work of trying to write a story where I take what I've learned about the facts of these musicians' lives, and then try to imagine what situations they might have been in that I have to make up. So that's what I've tried to do. And in terms of the language, all the years I've listened to music, I guess it's impacted me, particularly in terms of improvisation. And I've tried, I guess, in poetry when I started writing, to try to do what I guess Zora Neale Hurston says when she said she wanted to create crayon enlargements of life.
Yes.
And of course, I'm going to fail to approximate or to recreate music, but I think that if I can find a way to get close to how something sounds on a page, that would at least give some kind of approximation of what it would sound in words. So that's been my effort, and much of what I've written, to try to improvise on dialogue, to not only capture the way people speak, but also to capture how something might sound, how a musician might sound, with the inability to actually capture it, but to see if the words, the language, can come off of the page in a way that can recreate in some way the experience of listening.
Well, you do an excellent job of that. So music obviously has played a large part in your life. Talk about the role of music in your life, because I imagine that part of that is autobiographical, and your rationale for putting that or making sure that's centered in both of your books, music, and particularly jazz and rhythm and blues.
Yes. Well, my parents had these old 33 and a third records, which were the size of about 78s. And they listened to music all the time. My father introduced me to Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Jimmy Lunsford, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald. They used to go to the Savoy Ballroom and the Renaissance Ballroom to dance, to go out. And so all of that, those experiences, I guess I absorbed. And I, started listening to music very early, and it became part of my nervous system. So
Your nervous system, okay.
I didn't have much choice. And so when I began to think about writing, it was something that just emerged because it had always been there.
Right. So why did you choose Miles? What was
Well,
the motivation behind this book, particularly?
well, Miles, he is one of the artists that I've gravitated toward since I was a teenager, beginning in the mid to late 1950s. And there was an attitude that he had, which I responded to, as well as that he was short. So, and had a way of presenting himself that was very much reflected in his music, the kind of short, compressed way of playing, only leaving room for spacing, and only saying what he had to say in the notes that it took to say it.
Yes.
And I think that's why he gravitated toward musicians who presented what they had to say in ways that were very sparse and economical, of course, with the possible exception of Coltrane. So I was interested again in a situation, an incident that took place in 1959 on August 25th. And I guess the novella, or the form of the novel, it necessitated that it be contained, compressed, and short, because I guess to my mind, that's how Miles played.
Yes.
His sense of a group. And that night was something that I was always intrigued by. He had just recorded Kind of Blue, that seminal LP. Billie Holiday had passed away in July. Lester Young in March. So there's this moment where he is at a crest or plateau in his musical evolution, and then he's ready to make a transition from that to his next iteration with that second group that he formed with Wayne Shorter, Ron Carter, Herbie Hancock, and Tony Williams. So this is a moment of transition. The other thing is that I wanted to have Frances Taylor have a more pivotal role in this, because she was not just Miles's muse. She often is sort of diminished by saying that she inspired him. I mean, she was an artist in her
Yes,
own
in her
right.
own right. Yes.
And she danced with Catherine Dunham, was part of the company. She was one of the first Black women to appear in the Paris Opera Ballet in 1948, and was in the original production of West Side Story. So I probably would not have written this novella had not I wanted to find out something about Frances Taylor and incorporate her artistry within the story as well.
Right. So you end up holding up women, Black women, and the Black man, and really centering the role of the musician. It's one of the artists, the role of the musician. Talk about that, because you mentioned earlier, and I think it also comes out in your book, about how the jazz musician is very, very deliberate in how much time he spends talking, that you have to listen very carefully. And he's only saying, I'm probably not saying it the way you would, but what he needs to say. Talk about what you were saying around the role of the musician and the role of the artist in general.
Well, I think it was Albert Murray who said that Black musicians, Black artists have the repository of the culture. They give us ourselves, reflect ourselves back to us by what they have to say artistically. And for me, music, jazz in particular, R&B, has been the most influential on my life personally, and it clearly defined my efforts as a writer. Um, so I guess it was inevitable that I would gravitate toward music and try to capture something of the jazz musician in particular, who is not and still is not honored in the country of its birth. And it has always been an arduous experience for Black musicians to find the kind of regard and respect in this country as far as their craft, and even, of course, try to make a living. And so that was also something I wanted to do with this book. And also in a previous collection of short stories that I wrote, Dance of the Infidels, which it follows the period of the big band era leading into modern jazz, the 1930s to 1940s. So that also covers the musicians of that period who are, of course, well known within those who follow the music closely, but it seems to be kind of an outlier in terms of the knowledge that people have of what extraordinary contribution Black music has given this country. It is, many have said, the music that is most representative of the culture.
Yes.
That it was created here. The quintessential American music. So I think all of those elements have played into my writing, and particularly this experience of improvisation.
Yes, most definitely. So talk a little bit about the impact of the Black arts movement, because in this book, and more so in Tragic Magic, you really see the impact of the Black Power movement, Black arts movement, Vietnam War on your writing. What has been the role and that role in your art, in your writing?
Well, clearly, the Black arts movement of beginning in the mid 1960s was quite influential. I was, again, that generation of writers such as Jane Cortez, Amiri Baraka, Tony Cade Bambara, Haki Mabuti, Nikki Giovanni, Carolyn Rogers, June Jordan, Audre Lorde, all of those writers and others had an extraordinary impact on me. I mean, they were all about 10 years older than I was. So as someone who is about 20, early 20s, I'm looking at these writers who were writing in a way that I was sort of taken with and wanted to find out if I could be a writer at all. And I think that that they were my sort of guide to try to find out whether I was a writer or not. And their influences, particularly again, their use of language that was quite musical, not in the sense of trying to recreate the sound of music or jazz, but in the way language was used. And so those stories and novels and poetry were instrumental to me as I listened and then began to find my way to wanting to put that listening to use in terms of writing.
Right. So let's pivot to Tragic Magic, which, as I read it, it seemed to be very autobiographical because you were a conscientious objector. So can you just give us the brief synopsis of that, of Tragic Magic, which I found fascinating also.
Well, it's a novel, probably my
Tragic Magic, Tragic Black. Sorry.
It's probably the most autobiographical book that I've written. Of course, it was my first novel, and first novels usually, not always, but are often autobiographical. So, but it begins with a young man named Melvin Ellington, of course.
Yes, music again.
Yeah, who is just being released from prison after serving 2 years for not going into the army. And so that is the sort of the jumping off point for this story of Melvin trying to reacclimate himself back into the world that he left. So it has flashbacks into his childhood as well as the people that he reconnects to from the neighborhood he had lived in, and also as he hangs out with some friends of his on that first night. And there are also, of course, these riffs on his past and his present, which again I attempted to try to see how well I could capture in language. Again, a kind of music, the emotional feeling of what music was or is for Melvin Ellington through what I guess Ralph Ellison might say a literary equivalent of what the music is doing. And of course, it is going to ultimately fail because you can't reproduce that music, but the effort is to try to get close to what that experience felt like on the page. So
as I was reading it, I kept imagining that this was a play, that I was in the play. I was, in the play, watching the play. And you are also a playwright. The style you use of going back and forth, and the fact that both of these books are relatively more like novellas than they are long novels. How would you say your experience in playwriting impacts your writing, or has impacted your writing?
Well, I would say it's compression. That language is very important, and I've discovered that the dialogue or the conversations in plays have to not attempt to duplicate the way we speak, because the way we speak is full of all kinds of oohs and ahs and detours, and it could be, becomes very scattered often. But the language of a play has to be very precise. A playwright once said, I remember saying, that the dialogue in plays has to be written with an axe. And I guess the sharp edges that sort of really cuts the words down to their essentials. And usually for me, a play begins to insinuate into me when I am troubled by something. And usually it's confined to a particular space. It doesn't venture too much, be a room,
Right.
an apartment, a house, because it's because of the confinement. You can't do, you can't create, excuse me, in a play, the world, you have to contain the world in a limited amount of space. And you can go from waiting to Godot to plays, Baracas, Dutchman, a play, Richard Wesley has a play called, I think it's Going Through Changes, where a father and son, father hasn't seen his son, they've been separated, and they're in a pool hall, and they begin to try to talk to each other indirectly through shooting pool. So those are the kind of situations for me accommodate the play form. Again, compression and the use of space where the situation is confined.
Right. You've alluded to many aspects of your writing process and what you think about. What message do you give to students when you're teaching playwriting and fiction writing? What is the message, and what do you talk to them about? What's important about craft?
Well, I think that I think the form or the craft of writing anything well comes from I think the three things. I think William Faulkner says that a writer should three things that are most important are experience, imagination, and observation. And those are the things that I often try to convey to young people that I've worked with, and also reading. To read everything that you get your hands on, listen, music, what all the artistic forms. And I think the technique or the form that one ends up writing, poetry, fiction, drama, will emerge out of those elements. Sort of imperceptibly, you begin to find your way or your own voice. So I don't think a writer begins with technique. I think they begin with things that are more intimate, their own experience, looking at the world, being open to it, and paying attention, and the use of their imagination. With those elements, observation and experience should hopefully expand and cause, sort of kind of fertilization of one's imagination.
Right. Yeah, you talk about reading, and I always think about writers being in conversations with other writers. You're obviously in conversations with musicians. Who are you in conversation with as a writer? Who are you reading? What are you reading now? And just share with us those who haven't. I know that's a lot.
Yeah. Well, again, I would say writers should read everything that they can. As far as influences, again, music has probably been my greatest influence on me, and writers who I'm engaged by who use language in a certain way. I would say Tony K. Bambara, June Jordan, Gwendolyn Brooks, Robert Hayden, and novelists, of course, Ellison, Toni Morrison. The list is too long for me to mention, but writers who try to convey an experience, but in a way that alters the way we see life, our experiences. There's an example of there's this photographer, Robert Frank, who was an immigrant, came to this country from a Scandinavian country, and he traveled throughout this country. He had a book, his first book, I think it was called The Americans, from driving around the United States. And there's a photograph he takes of the Hollywood sign, which everyone has seen.
Yes,
but,
of course.
But he took the photograph from behind, where you have these struts holding up the sign in a way to suggest, at least to me, that you have this gaudy, dream factory, celluloid, but what's holding it up is something that is not so glamorous. And it just had an amazing effect on me. I think that's the kind of thing that, for me as a writer, I always wait to have those kinds of experiences. So I would say that that is what, for me, writers do, the ones that teach me the most.
Okay. So when you look at what people are writing now, contemporary Black writers, and the state, if you had to comment to the extent that you do, the state of Black literature, what would you say? Where do you see it going? What is its future?
Well, the future is unlimited. I mean, the writers that are younger writers who are writing today are just part of a continuum that has, that has come before. So, and I think, some of the most exciting work that's being done is by African American poets, novelists, short story writers, and I think the influence of hip hop has been extraordinary in terms of, again, the language, the sampling, which is a form of improvisation, taking things from other forms and then incorporating that into whatever the verbal play is. So I think all of these things have advanced the art form, and I'm quite heartened by just the numbers, or at least the ways in which the proliferation of what is becoming more available in terms of writing. It hasn't always been that way. It's always difficult to get anything published or to find your way into any position where you gain access to the public sphere. So, 30, 40, 50 years ago, of course, things were a lot more difficult, but I'm heartened that those doors have been pushed open primarily by the artists themselves.
Right. It's definitely much more interdisciplinary, and you cannot find, people are blurring the genres.
Yeah, very much
and
so.
So that even though they may be a poet or a playwright, you see all elements in the craft they create. As we come to a close, I want to remind our listeners that we're talking with Wesley Brown, and who's the author of Blue and Green and also Tragic Magic. And so I want you to please purchase his books. You can go to your independent bookseller. You can request it. You can get it online. And we want to make sure that we are always supporting writers. And so as we come to a close, some people would say that we are at a point in our lives where we really don't need conferences devoted to Black writers. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's always productive for writers, artists to come together and have conversations among themselves. Writers' conferences, I think, often are given too much value in the sense that many people go to a writers' conference in order to learn how to write. And my feeling is that is not a place, is not a sort of a greenhouse for the experiences that make an artist. I mean, I think they can be valuable in the sense that it brings artists together, but the sense that one is going to come away with some manual in order to proceed in as far as gaining some access or gaining experience as far as becoming a writer or an artist. It goes always back to the doing. There's, you don't write by talking about writing, thinking about writing. One learns how to write by writing, by reading, by listening.
Right. And that's what we try to do at the National Black Writers Conference. In fact, I call it a public gathering where you can have conversations among writers and also participate in what we call talk shops and look at what's new and look at what people are producing. So it's a public gathering, sort of where you have community conversations to discuss the issues. And also, as you said, to be motivated and inspired. And I know that you've attended our National Black Writers Conferences in the past. Mm-hmm. And so thank you for that. So we are out of close. Again, I want to remind our listeners that we've been speaking with Wesley Brown, and Wesley Brown is the author of Blue and Green and Tragic Magic. Please support Wesley Brown. Go out and purchase the books. They're fascinating. As I was reading them, I wanted to listen to music, and I put music on in the background. And his use of language is fascinating and very, very musical and filled with improvisations. So again, this is Dr. Brenda Greene. Thank you again, Wesley Brown, for having this conversation with us. And remember, the writer is always reading. As Wesley reminds us, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. And this broadcast is paid for by Medgar Evers College, writers at mec.cuny.edu. Thank you. Come back next week.